In presenting this history of Altona, we commence with the front view of the homestead, erected roughly about 1841, because it is shown on Hoddle's first map of the area, dated 1842. It was not built in the present form, but there was an east wing and a west wing, and the building was subsequently added to over the years until it was essentially in its modern form about 1920. In its first 40 to 50 years, it was the headquarters of a pastoral property extending over an area of approximately up to a maximum of 20 square miles. Associated with the building was a lookout tower situated behind it to the left as we view it, whereby the people in the homestead were able to know where the flocks and herds were, and conversely the people who were looking after the herds and the sheep would know where the homestead was. As we view the homestead from a different angle, to our right we can see what is now the beautiful Altona Library. In the early days, situated where the library now stands, were the stables of the old homestead, made out of bluestone, and subsequently used as the years went on both as stables, butcher shops, grocer shops. During the Second World War, the headquarters of the Altona ARP, then a storeroom for the council, until finally pulled down about the year 1964, when the present library was erected. The homestead was surrounded by a lovely lot of old trees, particularly Moreton bays, which were planted, as far as we can tell, about the same time as the homestead was erected in the 1840s. Unfortunately, a large number of these were blown down in a severe cyclone which came through the area in January 1982, causing injury and even death. Around to our right, on the corner of the street called Pier Street, which obviously runs down to the pier, there used to be in the 20s, the 30s and the 40s the local picture theatre, and that was a headquarters of many of the activities of the Altona residents at that time, because as well as pictures being shown, there were also staged musical comedies, concerts, etc. The whole of the homestead was surrounded at a fairly distance of about half a mile, both to the right and to the left and to the north, by a hollow square of large trees making a homestead paddock, and the fourth side was of course the beach down to the south. At that time there were apparently, from what we could see in the early days, an old seawall which in the 20s had remnants of wooden piers along there. We move now to we are now viewing Pier Street, which is one of the first streets which comes to mind when we consider that the pastoral property which we have just spoken about was subdivided in 1887 to form the present town of Altona. It was held within the boundaries of Maidstone Street, what was known as what is now Civic Parade, but was then Nellie Street, and down to the eastern end was Victoria Street. At that stage, it was bought from the Pastoral Company by Mr. Clark, a Williamstown businessman, for subdivision. He formed the Altona and Leverton Freehold and Investment Company with a capital at the time of £200,000. They laid water mains and signed a contract to build a railway and also to erect a pier. The syndicate included John Blythe, James Hosey of Hosey's Hotel in Melbourne, David Munro, Henry Alcock, William Perryman and Ross McCartney. The railway was built down as far as Pier Street, where we are now. The pier was at 1,300 feet long, and the whole area was called Altona. As we view the pier now, on our left, down at the far corner, was the first block of land ever sold in Altona, the one on the corner of Pier Street and the Esplanade. For many years, this held a cafe known as the ABC Cafe, but the area was taken over by the Altona civic authorities and now has been transformed into a park. Land at the time that it was being subdivided sold up to $26 or £13 per foot. They used to bring the people down by ferry to the pier, which was considerably longer than it is now. Sales were held on successive Saturdays in the September, October and November of 1888, but unfortunately the prevailing land boom burst in 1890. The pier, we must realise that originally it was about as as long again and had a large crane at the far end, and that many of the early paddle steamers that used to ply the waters of Port Phillip brought both holiday makers and those who were coming to buy land to Altona. Unfortunately, while it was subdivided in 1888, as previously mentioned, the land boom burst in 1890 and most of the activity in the area stopped at that point. And so it was comparatively unchanged from the period from 1890 until about the early 1920s. Just before that, however, there had been a certain amount of activity in the area because of the presence of a camp for the First World War soldiers. As we view right up at the pier, up along the Esplanade to our right, in the far distance we may just be able to see the remains of the old pier to do with the explosives compound, which lay right away up there and which we will deal with later on in this series. Across to our left and toward the front we see the trees on the Point Cook point, which has an old homestead on it and which has been taken over by the government and is to be turned into a public park and recreation area. The interesting point to remember is that as we view this intersection, back in the 1820s there was a band rotunda directly in the centre of what is now the intersection where the car is now passing, and of course both the main street and the Esplanade were unmade, they were just sand. The pier at that time, if you follow the line of the top decking, used to cross the road, that is prior to the erection of the bandstand, and come right across and terminate up to our right, about halfway up between up Pier Street between here and the parallel street further up called Queen Street. Try and visualise that as we view that the pier running right across and terminating about halfway up that block. Subsequently, when traffic became greater, the bandstand was taken away from the intersection and placed down on the beach, and to the left of the pier, and was there for quite a considerable time until it was assailed by the elements, gradually fell into decay, and was finally taken. Now at the extreme eastern boundary of Altona, and in front of us lie a couple of very interesting objects. We see the end of the present made road, and running around to the left is an unmade section. This is the original road into Altona, the way that they used to come back in 1888 when Altona was first subdivided. It has never been made to a modern standard, although it has a very rough corrugated surface made out of old round stones. In front of us we see an area dominated by trees, locally known always as the Pines. It has always been a recreation area, and back in the 1930s was the ground of the Altona Baptist Hockey Club. There their headquarters were made. They built their own pavilion, and it was from there that subsequently and in years later that club became the Altona Hockey Club, now situated at the other end of the city and one of the strongest in Victoria. Beyond the Pines lay what in the last years of last century was the Williamstown Racecourse, the third largest racecourse in Victoria and one of the most popular. We will proceed around there where we can expand. From this vantage point we see that the Pines, on which we have just commented, has become the Pines Scout Camp and is the headquarters of scouting in the area, and the boys are doing a very great job with their activities there. Swinging around to our left, in front of us is an open area where originally was the Williamstown Racecourse. This has now become an open area used for sporting activities of many kinds. The buildings that you see are in the neighbouring area of Williamstown, but the dividing line between the two has been altered over the years. Just particularly in front of us, in this area a few metres away, was where the home was of the caretaker of the then racecourse, and this was a very popular racecourse, as mentioned previously, the third most populous and advantageous one in Victoria. The people who came to the racecourse used to come in the very early days, in the early 1880s, across on train from the Newport station on a line running parallel to the Geelong line, and then it swung south and terminated on the other side of Cororoit Creek, which lies just immediately in front of us as we look north. From there they came across to the racecourse by means of either a footbridge or a ford over the creek. Subsequently, the line was extended across to this side of Cororoit Creek Road, and the racecourse platforms, as they were known, were very, very busy on race days, with many trains parked there and general activity. However, since the termination of the racecourse, which unfortunately stopped when the grandstands, which were used for troops during the Second World War, were burned down during reconstruction in the late 1940s, and from that time on the racecourse was abandoned as such. The racecourse platforms fell into disuse, and we will see them later. Just now, as at this point, looking west, we note with interest that the railway bridge over the Cororoit Creek is being renewed by the Railways Department. This bridge, as far as we know, consists of the original structure as built back in the 1880s with certain modifications, and now, in order to meet modern demands, it is to be redone under modern conditions with a concrete structure. We see also that there is wildlife in the area, and we see in front of us some black swans that are taking the opportunity to net. We are now approaching the ford crossing Corroyd Creek, crossing the Corroyd Creek. This was one of the two ways into Altona, or it was one of the alternative, because side by side with it in the early days was a bridge whereby vehicles could come over. But when the ford was covered with water, they would use the bridge. When the creek was low, they would use the ford. And that is the one over which we are passing now. As we come up, we are heading now towards Corroyd Creek Road, but we will pause in a few moments to take a closer view of the remains of the old racecourse platforms associated with the railway activities at the time when the racecourse was at its... In front of us we see a mound which is the sole remaining remnants of the original racecourse platforms, which contained several trains used by the racers when they were on. Beyond that, and on the other side of the line, where you may see some trees, in the old days was the planned township of Wyndham across to our right. If we turn the other way and look to our left, where the industrial estate is now was the planned township of Epsom. These were only planned localities on a map because at the time of the previously mentioned Great Depression of the 1890s, all buildings stopped and they never progressed beyond the blueprint stage. We see the platform of what is known as Mobiletown. This platform was specifically built by the railways to assist in the development of the oil works which lie beyond it. After the building of the oil works had been completed and the company had no further use for it, they sold it back to the railways for what was used to be known as a peppercorn fee of 1 shilling, or the equivalent at the time of decimal change of 10 cents. This was just to fulfill the legal requirements of the deal. We are now situated at the intersection of the Altona and Geelong lines, and we see in front of us a train proceeding towards Melbourne on the Geelong line. Beyond that Geelong line and where the open area is, used to be one of the early settlers of the Altona area, who was David Ross, who held land there, that particular area of land, in the 1844-1845, and had a homestead there named Hatton. We are now facing toward the east, and in the particular area in front of the camera was Melbourne's first infectious diseases hospital, erected by the Melbourne municipalities in 1882, and subsequently was shut down about 1890, associated with the infectious diseases hospital, and just in front of where the camera is now, in front of us, was the old graveyard associated, the cemetery associated with it, where 4 or 6 interments were made in the middle 1880s. This small cemetery was well known to Altona residents in the 1920s, 1930s, when it was viewed from the train as it proceeded down to Altona. It was then abandoned during the Second World War, and it was only during the period of the 1850s, when the present oil works were to be built, that they remembered officially that there was a cemetery in the area, and a special act of Parliament had to be promulgated to close it down about We are now standing on the northern bank of the Cororoit Creek. This particular creek in the old days was navigable by a small boat right up from the sea past where we are now up to practically what is now Geelong Road, where there was a large area which has just been filled in, known to the Aborigines of the area as Budjacani's Hole. This has recently been filled in and used as a tip by the municipal authorities. At this point, I must add that Altona in the early days was a very, very favourite haunt of the Aboriginal people, and that there were large camps there, and that over the years many relics of their occupation have been found. As we move south, we pass over the outlet of the what is now known as Cherry Lake, formerly known as the Swamp, and a favourite hunting spot for the Aborigines for game of all kinds. In front of us also lies the suburb of Altona known as Seaholme. The road on which we stand now, known as Miller's Road, was put in at a later date, the original road that we have come along lying across to our left. Altona proper lies to our right, across from the foreground where we have Cororoit Creek, then a rise, and then the swamp or Cherry Lake, just barely seen in the distance. As we move around to the west, we see part of the industrial area which has grown up on the northern flank of Altona, but as can be seen, there is still a very large area of open land which has been very fortunately kept for the use of the public. Moving around past the west and to the north, we see the COR oil refineries, one of the first of the industrial areas built around Altona. Coming around past the north and back towards our starting point, we see to our right the area with the tanks of the oil installation here, which was commenced in the middle 1950s and has been the precursor of the great industrial expansion which has taken place in front of us. As we look to the west, we get a good view of Cherry Lake and the spillway which takes the excess water out to the sea. This has been made a very, very nice lake for the inhabitants by taking the old swamp, which is fed by Skeleton Creek, which at this point runs parallel with Cororoit Creek, and damming it up. And as you can see, it hosts quite a varied number of wildlife. There are ducks, and in season black swans, and migrating birds of all types. Back in the 30s, when this was still a swamp, an enterprising showman built around it a motor raceway. This was used on several occasions, but fell into disuse when it was found that it was not a profitable. 180 degrees, we see the outlet of the swamp, and going down to its enlarged area, and the road bridge down there where it debouches into the sea. Added to that list of wildlife previously mentioned, We must add that on occasions there are large quantities of pelicans which come around. We are now looking northwest along Cororoid Creek Road to where it intersects with the Geelong railway line. As we come south across what is known, or what was known as, Rowden's Paddock, because in the 30s and the 40s a farmer named Rowden used to run his cows across there. We see some trees. These trees indicate the spot where the son of one of the original settlers, William Cherry, who came to the area in 1844 and whose name is perpetuated in Cherry Lake, his son, Robert, lived at a house called, or selection called Seaford, S-E-A-F-O-R-D, which was situated just where those trees are in front of the camera. However, all trace of that building has now been lost. Referring back to the reference of Mr. Rowden and the cows in the area, we are now viewing some of what could have been the descendants of those cows, because as we see, the area is still used for dairy. We are now on Cororoid Creek Road looking north, and in front of us we see an old cattle ramp, and as we view across the paddocks we see some of the original stone fences that go back at least 100 years, and these are some of the most easterly of the stone fences which go down to the stony rises of the Western District. Viewing these, we can see and appreciate the remnants of the pastoral area which Altona and its surroundings used to be. All the original settlers down in this area had pastoral properties and went in for sheep, cows and all the various things that have to do with an Australian farm. As we move toward the west, as we see across in the middle of a number of plantation of trees was where one of the Cherries, the sons of the original Mr. Cherry who came to this area, where his house used to be. How unfortunately we are now in an area west of Maidstone Street behind the Slough Estate. The Geelong line lies to our north, Laverton lies in front of us, and the golf course, the Kringle Golf Course, lies to the south. At this point we are standing just next to the remains of what was known as the New Altona coal mine, which was operative from the years 1928 to 1931, and although it did not produce very much coal, has the distinction of being the last coal mine to operate in the Melbourne metropolitan area. All that is left now is some concrete remains with bolts and some brickwork, and the remains of other debris which has been dumped here over the years. The berry bushes indicate the site of the original shaft that was situated here, but which, as I said before, closed down in 1931. We are now viewing the cairn, which signalises and shows the approximate spot where the shaft put down in 1908 by the Melbourne and Altona Colliery Company in order to extract coal from the area. The shaft was over 300 feet deep, and there was a 69-foot thick bed of coal, and between the years 1908 and 1919, over 30,000 tonnes of coal were extracted. You will notice from the inscription on this stone, this particular monument was erected by the Altona Shire Council in conjunction with the Altona Historical Society. The coal which was extracted from here was the culmination of quite a number of attempts and shafts that were put down in the surrounding area from Newport down to Laverton and around over a period of several years going back to the early 1890s. But this particular one, known as the Old Altona Shaft, was the one from which the maximum amount of coal in the area. We are now at number 32 Wren Street, West Altona, and observe on the edge of the footpath and by the wall there is a certain area where the cement is raised. This indicates the spot where Hosey of Hosey's Hotel in Melbourne put down a shaft in the year 1894, 324 feet deep, and struck a thick bed of coal 69 feet thick. Going deeper, they struck the sub-artesian basin and the workings were flooded, and soon we are observing the fence of the explosive reserve which lies to the west of Altona proper. Some traces still remain on it of the coloured camouflage which was placed there during the Second World War. This has been protected by the trees to some extent, and the yellows, greens, blues and reds are still faintly visible. Behind the fence was the explosive reserve going back to the period of 1884 when hulks were anchored out in the bay. It can be observed from the notice being photographed. This reserve has been in existence since 1897 when it was taken over by the government, an area of 550 acres, opened on the 1st of May, serving the home of the manager of the explosive reserve, who for a considerable period was Mr. Grant. From this particular 550 acre capacity, it extended to the capacity of 500 tonnes was increased in some cases to 1,100 tonnes of explosive in 61 magazines, and this was considered enough to blow the whole of Melbourne off the map. There was a 2-foot tram line whereby horse-drawn trucks were taken to Laverton Station. This was closed down in 1943, and finally the reserve closed most of our survey of the explosive reserve. We look at the remains of the explosives pier, from which over many years explosives were taken both to and from ships out in the bay by special lighters. These were a familiar sight. They were coloured red and plied their way to and fro from the pier to the ships which were waiting for them. To complete this survey of Altona, which we've briefly done, we must think of two of the past views of it. Firstly, back in the 1840s to 1880s as a pastoral property, and finally a description of 1911, which would be about 50 persons living in 15 houses scattered over the area. Some water, no public transport, no doctors, no hospital, few shops, no schools, and little, if any,